This city did not deserve this terrible assault on its citizens, on its peace of mind, on its sense of security. No city does, no state, no people.
Let us be clear. It does not have to be this way.
His unique character is one of integrity and honesty, and he's well respected throughout the entire conference.
Hello, I'm Robert Costa in Washington. Welcome to America Decides. Authorities in Maine are searching for the gunman who killed 18 people and injured more than a dozen others in a mass shooting Wednesday night. The suspect has been identified as a 40-year-old Army reservist, Robert Card. Officials say he opened fire at 2 locations in Lewiston, Maine, and remains armed and dangerous. He faces an arrest warrant for 8 counts of murder. CBS News correspondent Bradley Blackburn joins us now from Lewiston. Bradley, thanks for being here. What is the latest on the search?
Well, Robert, we know law enforcement officials from multiple agencies are participating in this manhunt right now. ATF agents, U.S. Marshals, all assisting the FBI and local officials here trying to locate this suspect, 40-year-old Robert Card. The manhunt has now been going on approaching 24 hours, and so the urgency grows with every passing hour. They are expanding their search into heavily wooded areas surrounding this community, even into the waterways. So they're looking at all possible avenues to try and get a read on where he may be, because there's real concern, Robert, that there is still an ongoing threat to this community and to the law enforcement officials that are trying to track him down. And until they're able to capture him, this community is grieving while they're essentially frozen in place.
How are people in Lewiston responding? I know they're grieving. What else is it like there on the ground?
It's eerie, Robert, because so much of this city is shut down. People really are heeding this warning. You go walk down the street here and restaurants are closed, gas stations are closed, schools are closed, and so you don't see anybody out really in this environment. They're staying home, trying to stay safe. And another visible sign of that, Robert, is that you'll notice behind me, we're outside of the bowling alley here. There really is no makeshift memorial like you would so often see following a mass shooting. We've seen it time and time again, but not at this location. I think it is a sign that people are listening to officials, staying home, and we know that the town is planning a vigil once they're sure that it's safe.
And finally, Bradley, what are the next steps for law enforcement and for community leaders at this point?
Well, they're certainly continuing to probe what happened here, Robert, how the background of this suspect. We know at this point that he is an Army reservist, somebody who's very familiar with weapons. And there were some clear warning signs here with concerns about his mental health. We know over the summer that his own military commanders were concerned about some warning signs and were, in fact, the ones that referred him to treatment for 2 weeks in the summer. From a law enforcement bulletin, we understand that he had self-reported experiencing delusions and hearing voices sometime more recently. So there are real questions about why those warning signs perhaps were missed, what could have been done. But the main priority, again, Robert, is to locate this individual and to start to provide some closure to this community so that they can no longer worry about being harmed and start to heal.
Healing. We wish the best for that community, and thank you for your reporting. Bradley Blackburn, thank you. To discuss the Biden administration's response to the Maine shooting, CBS News chief White House correspondent Nancy Cordes joins us now. Nancy, thank you for being here. Tell us more about the Biden administration's response to this tragic shooting.
Hi, Robert. Well, we got a statement from the president earlier today. We know that he has been briefed routinely on the situation in Maine. He said that he and his wife, the First Lady, had been praying for the victims, but that he didn't want to stop at prayers. He called for a new assault weapons ban, banning not just assault weapons, but high-capacity magazines, a bill to enact universal background checks to require safe storage of guns and immunity and ending immunity from liability for gun manufacturers. It's a pretty familiar list because we hear it from the White House anytime there is a mass shooting like this one, sadly, but we also know that the votes simply aren't there on Capitol Hill, particularly in the Republican-led House of Representatives. There was an interesting moment today. The Vice President, Kamala Harris, was meeting with the Prime Minister of Australia, who has been here for a state visit. And she pointed out the incredible disparity between gun deaths here in the United States, about 40,000 gun deaths in 2019 alone, compared to Australia, where they have very different gun laws, much more restrictive, only 229 gun deaths in all of 2019. She said it doesn't have to be that way, which drew loud applause from both the Americans and the Australians in the room, Robert.
Turning to the ongoing war in Israel, what is the latest on what's happening in Gaza and how the administration is evaluating the violence there?
Well, the administration says that some humanitarian aid trucks, about a dozen of them, did manage to get into Gaza over the past 24 hours. So some aid is trickling in, though they said it has not been fast enough. The president, in a press conference yesterday, Robert, said that he doesn't trust the numbers coming out of Gaza, coming from Hamas, about the number of civilians that have been killed. He says he's been told by his aides that those numbers are not reliable. But the White House acknowledged today that while they don't think those numbers are reliable, they still concede that the number of civilian deaths has most likely been in the thousands. And while they are reluctant to criticize Israel, they do continue to say that they believe that civilian lives should be spared whenever possible.
Let's dig a little bit more into that and listen to what John Kirby had to say today at the White House.
Well, we all know that the Gazan Ministry of Health is just a front for Hamas. It's run by Hamas, a terrorist organization. I've said it myself up here. We can't take anything coming out of Hamas, including the so-called Ministry of Health, at face value.
Nancy, as you listen to Kirby and evaluate and report on the White House, how do you see the White House and especially President Biden grappling with the dynamics inside the Palestinian area, inside the Israeli government? How are they balancing all of the different factors at once?
I think it's complicated, Robert, because on one hand, they are working to show the world that they support Israel's right to defend itself, that what happened to innocent Israeli civilians was heinous and deserves a response by the Israeli government. At the same time, they're well aware of public sentiment around the world and certainly concern for Palestinian civilians as well, and what they are facing, what they have faced historically. You already have, for example, the UN Secretary General a couple of days ago saying that that international law has been broken here by both Hamas and the Israeli military. So they know that that criticism exists. And while they don't want to criticize the Israeli government directly, they want to make it clear that they are worried about these civilians. And that's why the White House has been pushing for this humanitarian pause, basically not an entire ceasefire, but holding off on, certainly on a ground invasion until either civilians can get out or more aid can get in.
Nancy Cordes, thank you.
You're welcome.
Among the concerns surrounding the war between Israel and Hamas is whether the conflict could spread to other areas in the region. CBS News senior investigative correspondent Catherine Herridge posed that question to retired four-star general and former commander of the Special Operations Command, Joseph Votel. He was the top commander responsible for U.S. forces in the Middle East until 2019.
What are the game-changing implications to the October 7th attack from a U.S. national security perspective?
So the implications are here is if we aren't able to navigate this razor's edge effectively, we could find ourselves in a conflict that spreads beyond Israel and goes to other parts of the Middle East where it will obviously destabilize the situation and result in a much broader conflict than we currently have.
Just to take that a step further, do you see as part of the broader conflict Iran, even Russia and China?
Well, whether Russia and China get involved directly, I think is another matter. I don't know that they necessarily would do that, but both of them would benefit by the United States being tied up in another regional conflict here in the Middle East. Russia would be able to point to it as more problems caused by U.S. foreign policy, and China would be able to take advantage of it in their part of the world, the Asian Pacific here, because obviously a conflict in this part of the world would put a premium on our resources and on our attention and on our diplomatic and informational and economic efforts. And so it would draw attention away from the very important things we're trying to do out in the Pacific.
Meanwhile, Israel has delayed the expected ground invasion as the international community works to free hostages. UN officials say Gaza is on the verge of running out of fuel, threatening aid for civilians. House Speaker Mike Johnson is now responding to the Maine shooting, how he's approaching his position a day after winning the gavel. You're streaming America Decides. Welcome back to America Decides. A day after getting elected as House Speaker, Representative Mike Johnson, now Speaker Johnson, is responding to the deadly shooting in Maine. Earlier today, he called it a, quote, horrific tragedy.
This is a dark time in America. We have a lot of problems, and we're really, really hopeful and prayerful. Prayer is appropriate in a time like this, that the evil can end and this senseless violence can stop.
CBS News congressional correspondent Nicole Killian joins us now. Nicole, do you ever get rest? The speaker's race ends, the new speakership begins. Tell us more about how your reporting has unfolded today on the speaker's response to this Maine shooting. He's being tested from the start with a major national horrific event.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, it really is baptism by fire in terms of Mike Johnson's first day of the job, not only having to respond to this shooting in Maine, although when we pressed him about his thoughts on gun reform, gun safety legislation, he did not answer our questions. But, you know, there was also the Australian Prime Minister who was up here today that he met with. He just came back from a meeting with President Biden and congressional leaders, calling that a productive meeting. So it has been a very full day for the new speaker. But, you know, there are still a lot of questions that he has to answer about his past. He hasn't taken a lot of questions from those of us as reporters, particularly when it comes to his positions on the 2020 election, abortion, and other matters. Take a listen. We did try to ask him some questions directly today.
Can you clarify your role on the amicus brief? Do you believe the 2020 election was stolen, sir? Just yes or no? Just for the record, sir.
Now, as we know, the Speaker Johnson was an architect and spearheaded an amicus brief recruiting more than 100 Republicans in support of a lawsuit in Texas to overturn the results of the 2020 election. That was ultimately rejected by the Supreme Court. But it is a question that he has been asked time and again and has yet to answer questions in his capacity as Speaker as to whether or not he still holds those views and whether or not he believes the 2020 election was stolen. That being said, you know, we also, as you saw, tried to ask him about his positions on abortion. And important to note that CBS News has learned that even so far as back in 2005, there was an editorial that Mike Johnson wrote where he compared abortion rights to Hitler, also compared abortion to the Holocaust. Again, we have not been able to ask Speaker Johnson about that, but we did reach out to his office, and so far they aren't commenting.
No comment, but do you expect him to eventually wade into these issues and address some of these lingering questions?
Well, I think that's the hope. Obviously, you know, as we mentioned, it's been a very full day for the speaker. This, you know, he kind of was thrust into this role. So, you know, to a certain extent, today is really about trying to get his bearings, and probably for the next few weeks for that matter. And that is something that, you know, many Republicans acknowledge as well, in terms of he's going to need time to build up his staff. He's going to need time to try to build up his fundraising prowess. We also talked to a couple of members about some of his positions with respect to 2020, with respect to abortion, but specifically on the issue of 2020. Take a listen to what some members told us earlier today and why they still say they're supporting him as Speaker.
What about his views on the 2020 election and the role he played in that amicus brief? You don't have a problem with that?
Well, I certainly don't share and don't have agreement with him on all things. And what I would offer to you is what he said, I think, to several of us was, I understand that I have to represent my personal interest and my district's interest, but as Speaker, I've got to represent this conference and this House.
He is a member of Congress elected by his voters. They've elected him. He made that decision. I made the same decision, by the way. Does that mean that I'm no longer qualified to serve in leadership? Come on now.
So that is the position that many members are taking. I mean, earlier you heard there from Congressman Molinaro, who is from a swing district in New York, and his explanation here is, look, I may not agree with everything that the Speaker does, but at the end of the day, this is somebody that can bring our conference together, and that he doesn't expect the Speaker to impose his personal views in the speakership. He has to be a speaker for all members for the entire Republican conference. Congressman Donalds made a similar point. Other members I talked to today. So even if they are at odds with the speaker on certain positions, whether it's 2020, whether it's abortion, they still feel confident in his ability to lead this conference.
Nicole Killian, thank you for your reporting. We appreciate it. In a matter of days, Mike Johnson, the new speaker, has gone from little-known Louisiana congressman to Speaker of the House. Next, we dig into his political background with our panel. You're streaming America Decides. Welcome back to America Decides. House Speaker Mike Johnson, the new one, has the full support of the Republican conference, but he becomes the least experienced Speaker of the House since the 1880s. The Louisiana Republican was first elected to Congress in 2016, but you have to now go back to 1883 when Congressman John Carlisle was elected Speaker to have someone with this level of experience. Joining us now, Molly Balls and Olivia Beavers. They are top reporters in the country. Molly is a senior political correspondent at the Wall Street Journal. Olivia is a congressional reporter for Politico. Thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for coming from the Capitol. I know, were you at the Capitol too or no?
I was not today.
Okay, well, Capitol's a busy scene today, the new speaker.
Yes.
You're someone, Olivia, who's covered House Republicans for a long time. Mm-hmm. Do you know Mike Johnson?
I do know him. He's someone who was the Republican Study chair back in the day before he leapfrogged into leadership. And something that's pretty funny is it was pretty obscure. It's a number 7 in Republican leadership. And now that it's open, I have never seen so many people throw their names for a position so low in the race because they think maybe now they can jump too. But Mike Johnson is someone who's usually seems pretty happy and is bubbling around and accessible, at least to reporters in my experience.
Molly, Congressman Johnson comes out of nowhere to win the speakership, but I guess not relatively nowhere. He seems to have been laboring, politically speaking, in the conservative vineyards for many years, building relationships with advocacy groups, with conservative leaders. What's your read on his political capital?
Well, I mean, on the one hand, that lack of experience that you talk about is clearly a feature, not a bug in this case, right? It's clearly the case that because he didn't have the scars from a lot of these internecine battles that the Republicans have been so poleaxed by for the last 3 weeks, was a big reason that he was able to get into this position and finally become Speaker. But you're right, to your point, he is someone who has good relationships with a lot of conservative groups, the Republican Study Committee, a big power center for conservatives in the House, and the fact that he has chaired that tells you something about him. And, I was talking to our friend Matt Gaetz yesterday, and
I wouldn't use that phrase.
Someone we have spoken about before. That is what I mean.
Let's just
by
be clear.
That. No, nobody. We're not friends. Obviously, it's a professional relationship. But the point being that Matt Gaetz is taking a victory lap now for having gotten rid of Kevin McCarthy and replaced him with someone that he considers far more America first. But he is very close to Mike Johnson. They have been seatmates since they came to Congress together in 2017, and they serve on the same committees, Oversight and Armed Services. And so what Gaetz told me is he has a lot of trust and a lot of confidence in Johnson as someone who is going to pursue a much more aggressive oversight strategy toward the Biden administration, and as someone who he thinks will be able to bring a lot of conservatives on board with whatever approach he takes.
We're dealing with an audio issue with your microphone, so going to stick with Molly for a moment. It's not that I'm not trying to come to you, but let's get into that a little bit more. If the government funding fight is looming on the horizon, the supplemental is looming when it comes to Israel and Ukraine, who does this new speaker turn to? Is it Matt Gaetz, the congressman from Florida, or is it Steve Scalise, the majority leader from Louisiana? Who's he going to listen to?
I think the answer is yes to both of those questions. No, but I think who he's not going to be listening to is Kevin McCarthy, right? I mean, a lot of what we've seen play out over the past few weeks, and Olivia can certainly speak to this, is McCarthy fighting to try and install someone that he could still have some influence over, and being blocked from that by having a newcomer come in instead, whose relationship is much closer with McCarthy's frenemy, Steve Scalise. And McCarthy and Scalise have been rival power centers in the Republican conference. And so the fact that McCarthy doesn't really have an in with this new speaker, but Scalise does, and the Freedom Caucus guys, the conservatives really do, you know, he still has to, Speaker Johnson really still has to build out his staff and create a lot of new relationships, and he has a monumental task ahead of him. But I think it's clear that those are going to be some of the voices in his ear. What's your take on that point about he has to build out a staff, he has to build out relationships? Even some Republicans go, Mike who? I mean, they barely know him, even if they gave him unanimous support. You know House Republicans so well. What does Speaker Johnson's inner circle look like to you? Who are the real players in a Johnson speaker land?
So it's actually, he's kind of got his hands in a bunch of different groups. He's much more the type who's not going out drinking or socializing after hours. He's much more sort of in the prayer groups, in the civility caucus is one thing that he's a big part of. But probably his ties from being the Republican study chair at the Louisiana delegation, that's where he sort of has some close friends. And, you know, he's sort of that person who knows a bunch of people, but do they know him particularly well is a different question. And, you know, Molly was making this point. He doesn't really have this huge record as RSC chair and as the #7 House Republican. He wasn't really making waves by some of the votes he was taking. Sometimes, if you're in leadership, you have to take tough votes to protect a certain faction of your party, like the centrists. He hasn't really had to do that before. And so we were asking him about impeachment. And you have the right wing saying it's not a matter of if with him, it's a matter of when. But you have moderates who have basically said, hey, we're going to hurt if you try to go after Biden without a smoking gun. And we do know that they've approached Jordan before he failed to get the speakership, and they also approached Johnson and said, hey, you can't do this. This will blow back on us if you want to keep the majority. So that's something that you're seeing conversations happen is, can he be the same person that he was before?
It's an interesting point, because I first came across Mike Johnson listening to podcasts hosted by House Republicans, and he has his own podcast, and he reminded me of Mike Pence. Like, Mike Pence used to call himself Rush Limbaugh on decaf. Mike Johnson's kind of Rush Limbaugh on decaf, that smooth-talking cadence, but a deeply conservative agenda. How does President Biden handle this new speaker? We have about a minute left.
Well, so far, they've just met. And as you were saying before, a lot of even Republicans don't know him. I believe he'd never met Senate Leader Mitch McConnell before being elevated to the speakership. But, you know, I think we're going to see Democrats campaign against him very aggressively, calling him MAGA Mike. But that polite demeanor, that decaf persona that you talk about, the fact that he is able to come across so civilly is something that Republicans hope makes it more difficult to put him in a lot of negative ads than it would be with a Speaker Jim Jordan. And Democrats, even if he has a smooth cadence, they're going to use his position to restrict abortion rights, his election denial in 2020 against him in the 2024 races, no?
Oh, I'm sure that they are, and they were making that point on the House floor when he was being voted in. I think one thing to also watch is, does he decide to move legislation on the floor about abortion? And that's something that we're digging into, because it is something that he probably personally very strongly believes. But you have a faction, this more centrist wing, also members like Nancy Mace, who would say, don't do this. You're going to alienate us if you do. So seeing how he moves forward on that will also be an interesting study of his speakership.
Olivia Beavers, Molly Ball, thanks so much for coming by, and thanks for hanging tough through the audio difficulties. That does it for our show today. Thank you for streaming CBS News.